Welcome to Prescribed by Dr. Nathan Goodyear, where integrative oncology meets holistic healing. This podcast is your home for the latest in innovation, exploration, and elevation in all areas of integrative oncology, medicine, health, wellness, and beyond. Join me and a host of other innovators as we go from practicing to prescribing. Your daily dose of wellness begins now. Welcome to another hot take by Dr. Nathan Goodyear. Painkiller trusted for decades actually may leave a lasting mark on the developing brain. Of course, I'm talking about the press conference a couple days ago whereby President Trump and the NIH director and RFK, Secretary of Health and Human Services, were talking about the link between Tylenol and neurodevelopmental delay. Now, most people will equate that only to autism, but understand that's also ADHD, there's cognitive decline, cognitive delay, behavioral disorders. So there's other things involved in that, and autism is just one of them. But what happened in the response there, what you saw was how politics has invaded science. How one side of politics said, no, I'm going to take all the Tylenol I can, and I'm pregnant second, third trimester, which is egregiously problematic from a Tylenol perspective, from a baby, from a developmental brain perspective, because timing is everything there in neurodevelopment, particularly during the second and third trimester. But then we saw on the other political spectrum, people saying, well, it's just this one thing that Tylenol is impacting it. And people saying, well, no, it's not Tylenol that's contributing to autism, it's the vaccines, And so we get caught up in this kind of ideological, I think, box, and we can't let ourselves think outside of that. What I wanted to do is find a good systemic analysis, because there's studies out there, but there was a good systemic analysis that was actually published in August 2025, and it looked at Tylenol and neurodevelopmental delay. And this not meta-analysis, but systemic review, I think really dispels a lot of misconceptions about this concept. The NIH director talked about root causes. Root is the origin, obviously. Causes meaning there's multiple. And across social media yesterday, you had on one side everybody taking Tylenol that was pregnant, which is silly. And on the other side, you have people saying it's one cause. And we'll talk about that. The NIH director was talking about root causes. And what we're seeing here is we're seeing an oversimplification of the process because people are jumping into this magic bullet theory. And I talk about that repetitively throughout all of my posts, all of my writings, everywhere, social media. Paul Ehrlich in 1907 described the treatment of one disease with one chemical. That's where chemotherapy came from. Had nothing to do with cancer. He was treating syphilis with sulfarisane. That's 1907. Magic bullet theory. So people are out there saying, hey, look, what we've got here is a problem with glutathione, Tylenol, and that's what's causing the autism link. And then we on the other side say, no, there's no link at all. Let me down 5, 6, 12 Tylenol. Nobody there is following the science. And so in the arena of integrative oncology where I am, integrative medicine where I've been since 2006, we have to follow the science. We don't have to make things up as we go along. So this 2025 August systemic review showed in the high quality studies, and we'll go through those in just a second, there was very strong, repeat that, evidence of an association. Now, association doesn't prove cause and effect, but association proves a connection. And when we're talking about root causes, when you start adding more connections, you start adding more risk. And what our job as physicians is to do for our patients is to mitigate risk. Obviously, every treatment, there's risk and benefits. When the benefits are really outweighing the risks, then it's an easy decision, go with the benefits. If the risks, though, start to match the benefits, then there has to be a clear conversation about whether this risk is warranted for the benefits that you would get. So in this navigational review guide, this navigation guide review, as it was called in 2025, they looked at 46 human observational studies. And they looked at prenatal, so that's during pregnancy, Tylenol or acetaminophen exposure, and then they looked at neurodevelopmental outcomes. And they categorized these into 3 broad groups. The first was ADHD and ADHD-like symptoms, and here was included 20 studies. And there was over 100,000 different mother-child pairs that were involved. Now, what they found is the best evidence that was associated here was those found in biomarker studies, where they were actually following biomarkers, whether that be from cord blood or meconium stain. They found that these biomarkers provided the top level evidence as it related to the association between Tylenol and the ADHD or neurodevelopmental delay. 8 studies compared to the 20 actually looked at autism spectrum disorders. And 18 studies actually looked at other neurodevelopmental disorders, which include cognition, IQ issues, language, motor, emotional, behavior, or developmental delay. So you can see it's not just autism, as everybody was saying. Again, magic bullet, political ideology, or politics has no place in science. It just doesn't. Science is science, and when we keep it out, science works better. And we have to follow the science, quote unquote, not trust it, but follow it, because the science is always going to lead us down the correct path. And it doesn't always mean a definitive answer. Science can lead you down, well, gray areas that we don't know the exact mechanisms, but we have speculation. And so what they found is that the higher quality prospective studies here consistently, so it was not just one, it was multiple, showed positive associations between prenatal pregnancy, Tylenol exposure, and ADHD, autism spectrum disorder, and other neurodevelopmental delays. Okay? Again, that doesn't prove cause and effect, but when you have multiple studies showing a connection, and we'll get to in a second, another concept where when we're not talking about just one magic bullet, but we're talking about multiple connections, now we're starting to see that risk come equivalent to that benefit, and we have to really question whether that risk is worth it. Obviously, we're talking about here to the development. And what they also found is dose response effects, and the high quality studies support this, this connection as well. And what's interesting is the biological plausible mechanisms are described, and we'll touch on those in just a second. So though the risk is there, the biological mechanisms are equally plausible. It's like, aha, we have other studies supporting the mechanism of how, though this systemic review was not doing that. So let's go through what this article talked about as the plausible biological mechanisms. You would have to describe these as more theory, but understand other evidence has described this connection, this etiology. So placental transfer of Tylenol. When a mother takes Tylenol, it very equally equilibrates to the same dose in the developing baby. And it does so within an hour. And what's important about this is the developing brain of the baby, particularly during the 2nd and 3rd trimester, is incredibly vulnerable to oxidative stress at that moment. And Tylenol can interfere with that process. It can elevate the oxidative stress through the depletion of glutathione. Now, a lot of people out there said, that's the only risk. No. Much, much more complicated than that. So we have to talk first about that transfer. So toxic metabolites and oxidative stress. So what we have to look at here is Tylenol is detoxified via glucuronidation and sulfation, primarily in the liver, and that's how it is metabolized and excreted. Now, the problem is in the about 5 to 10%, so 90% is basically detox or conjugated via glucuronidation and sulfation, but about 5 to 10% is actually metabolized via CYP2E1, CYP3A4, and CYP1A2. Now, when that metabolism pathway, the cytochrome P450, those pathways, and this article particularly talked about the CYP2E1, it formed a toxic metabolite called N-acetyl-P-benzoquinine. And this toxic metabolite depleted glutathione. And when you have that depletion of the glutathione in the brain, what you're going to get is you're going to get a increased oxidative stress. And the relationship there is that it's obviously going to lead to neurodevelopmental delay. But it's through the oxidative stress because of the depletion of the glutathione, which the brain is obviously vulnerable at that point, and it has limited glutathione levels because it's already dealing with oxidative stress as it progresses through development. And so what happens then is you have the depleted glutathione, which by the way you see in cancer. It leads to oxidative stress. It leads to mitochondrial dysfunction, lipid perioxidation, and cell death. This is a mechanism we can actually use to actually target cancer and destroy it. But here what it's doing, it's leading to the targeting destruction of developing neurons in the brain, the connections, the synapses. And so then what we have is altered neurodevelopmental delay because the glutathione reserves or even levels were depleted. Now, another mechanism is prostaglandin disruption. Now, prostaglandins are important in brain development. Now, you may know about prostaglandins as it relates to inflammation, but what's interesting here is Tylenol is a weak cyclooxygenase inhibitor and a weak prostaglandin H2 synthesis inhibitor. And what this connection does is it reduces downstream production metabolites. So it reduces arachidonic acid to PGH2, and then downstream prostaglandins to PGE2, PGD2, PGF2 alpha, and PG12. The impact here is on neuronal development and synaptogenesis. So again, you're going to compromise the signaling here, compromising immune activity, inflammation, and you're going to compromise neurodevelopment, and you're going to compromise how the neurons connects, the synapses. And so what you're going to get is you're going to get developmental delay. Also noted here is the speculation that it alters microglia activity, which are types of macrophages within the brain that are very important in modulating the immune system there. And so what we have as a result is impaired synaptic wiring. We have impaired neuroplasticity, which is how that developmental process develops. You have hormone neuroimmune crosstalk, and all of this increases, because it's altered, increases the neurodevelopmental delay. And understand this impact here is not just occurring just broadly, it's actually occurring in the placenta, and that's disrupting hormones. And these hormones can actually cause sexual developmental delay as well as the neurodevelopmental delay. So in the male developing baby, you have a reduction in testosterone in the Leydig cells, and the female, you have a reduction in estrogen and progesterone. So it's clearly affecting the hormones. Also in the placenta, it's affecting HCG, it's affecting lactogen, so it's affecting many other hormones that come out of there that help to modulate the immune system. And it's the immune system that's very important here. When the immune system is balanced, it allows development, it allows appropriate development, it allows modulation and plasticity that promotes the development. But when the immune system becomes more pro-inflammatory, what you're going to get now is a disruption of that normal development. You get disruption of the normal synaptic formation between the neurons, disruption in the development of neurons and advancing together to form those synapses and that wiring across the brain. So what we have here is describing the mechanisms of which Tylenol in a sequential steps in a broad root causes mechanism is actually contributing to the process that actually promotes neurodevelopmental delay, including here autism. But we have to say that, obviously it's not just autism. Now, it also alters the endocannabinoid system. Now, the endocannabinoid system, you may have heard about that, but particularly it's related to things such as THC, CBD, but this is actually endogenous within the body. It includes things such as anandamide and 2-arachidonyl glycerol. Of course, they're binding to CBD1 and CBD2, and there's other receptors there. But what's happening here with Tylenol is it's actually leading to it's deacetylated, so it's metabolized down to a paraminophenol. And what this then does is it then blocks the reuptake of anandamide in the developing brain and overstimulates CBD1, CBD2 receptors. It also binds to the TRPV1 vanilloid receptors as well. And this promotes neuroinflammation and disrupts immune regulation. And when that happens during the second and third trimester, again, this disruption of immune regulation, inflammation disrupts development. And that's where you then get the disruption of the process of that developing brain, the synapses, the wiring, all coming together to give us that healthy brain born at birth. Now, we're just describing different mechanisms that have been proposed in the literature. And understand this Tylenol impacting different points, you might call it one hit. Now, what about hormone disruption? I've kind of mentioned that in hormones, Tylenol disrupts steroidogenesis, hormone production, in the placenta. And in the placenta, you're going to have altered impact on the developing immune system and the developing brain of the baby because of the disruption of the placenta. And what that does is it leads to alteration of actually sexual differentiation, brain maturation, brain development, and immune system programming. So in a way, Tylenol is reprogramming the inflammatory immune signaling, which is affecting the brain. And so it's reprogramming the brain. And it's this crosstalk disruption because of the hormones, because of the impact on the placenta that are affecting the immune system that's infecting the development of the brain. See, one of the things that we're working on in the cancer arena is we're actually working in modulating the immune system to actually promote healing in people with cancer. And here what we're seeing is just the opposite. We're seeing modulation of the immune system towards a pro-inflammatory situation, disrupting the immune signaling that actually alters development in a negative light, here, neurodevelopmental delay. And of course, when we talk about modulation, we can't leave without talking about epigenetics, meaning above genetics. It's not that you're changing the genome or the genetic sequence of the DNA, but you're actually changing the transcription and translation, so you're changing the expression of that. And what the research has showed is that Tylenol is altering the methylation pattern associated with neurodevelopment. And particularly it's showing examples such as glucocorticoid receptors, estrogen receptors, and other immune-related genes. And so the impact here is that the choices we make doesn't change our genetic code, but it changes the expression of those genetic code. And when we're talking about here in developing babies, second, third trimester, it's one choice that a mother makes that actually could impact, could being the key word there, it could influence the development of that brain. It could alter the development of that brain, and it's through epigenetics. It also changes the placental and fetal transcriptomics, meaning it's changing that process of genetic code into RNA, and this upregulates stress-related genes, and this downregulates neuronal brain nerve cells differentiation and the connections, synaptogenesis. So again, talking about the mechanism, you upregulate the stress because of the impact on the methylation. Here, epigenetics, you're going to alter the differentiation where you take an undeveloped cell to a more developed neuron, and that's development, maturation, and then you're also disrupting how it's connecting to other cells, thus leaving the brain slightly disconnected, rewiring it, reprogramming it to not communicate with other areas well. And so this alters the developmental delay here of the brain. Now, immune inflammation pathways, I've already mentioned that repeatedly, but because of these different areas, but we have to focus on this specifically. So what we know about Tylenol as it relates to placenta is it upregulates cytokine signaling. One in particular I want to focus on is interleukin-6, IL-6 or interleukin-6. This is a pro-inflammatory signal. I've already talked about pro-inflammation disrupting neurodevelopment, but here this cytokine signaling interleukin-6 is actually promoting oxidative stress, and this promotes inflammatory reprogramming within the brain. Now, interleukin-6, take that to cancer, promotes cancer progression. So one of the things that we have to do as we follow with treatment is modulate that interleukin-6, because if interleukin-6 gets out of control, it's pro-inflammatory, pro-tumor in the cancer perspective. But here, in the neurodevelopmental delay study that we're talking about here, particularly autism or ADHD, we have to look at what happens when interleukin-6 goes up. We get a pro-inflammatory and we get a suppression of neurodevelopment. And so we see that, but we have to understand that that connection doesn't just stop there. Okay, it's gonna lower the IQ, developmental delay that could result in autism, could result in ADHD or other behavioral disorders. But understand this is also setting the stage for potentially maybe increased cancer in the future, because cancer doesn't occur because of one hit, nor does autism occur because of one hit. But when you start to line things up, then you start to set the environment that allows it to develop. And exactly what's happening here is you're reprogramming, resetting the immune development and the neurodevelopment, and this is creating a new set point for development, one that doesn't fully develop and actually could promote disease. Beyond this, just looking at Tylenol, it upregulates nuclear factor kappa beta and MAP kinase pathways, which all deplete glutathione. They all promote disruption, promote inflammation, and this is a pro-inflammatory cytokine release syndrome that destroys proper development. Again, these are the proposed mechanisms, but these are research studies that have supported what this is systemic review discussed. Now, the gut microbiome is a very interesting one because Tylenol completely disrupts the gut microbiome. Everybody talks about the gut microbiome as it relates to what we eat and antibiotics, but very few talk about how the medications we take, whether that's prescribed or over the counter, how that impacts the gut microbiome. Tylenol causes dysbiosis. That's the imbalance of the gut microbiome. It also depletes the Bifidobacterium, which is a key bacterial taxa that is very important in health. Now, there's a recent My Baby Biome research study where they're actually recruiting children from the age 3 to 7 months and following them out 7 years, and they had a 2-year study update of the data, and what they found is that 25% of the babies had 0 Bifidobacterium. Now, when you're talking about developmental delay, when you're talking about future disease, particularly cancer, that is a very ominous sign. And here, Tylenol is depleting Bifidobacterium within the gut microbiome. It also lowers the gut diversity, and it lowers the healthy gut metabolites, such as small chain fatty acids. So here we're talking about the many different mechanisms. Again, not one hit, not one cause. When we're talking about root causes, the NIH director was causing, but we're talking about many different hit points of mechanisms which Tylenol is touching to alter appropriate, proper neurodevelopment, leading to neurodevelopmental delay, of which autism is one. Again, got to put that in proper context. Now, the authors of this systemic review, again, published August 2025, said, hey, maybe it's a 2-hit interaction model. It's a lot more complicated than that, but that was their proposal, in that Tylenol is 1 hit. But then when you add it to additional hits, such as, say, maternal infection, the baby born has infection, maternal fever, inflammation, oxidative stress, delivery, and then postnatal, such as whether they're breastfeeding, whether they delivered vaginally, whether they delivered via C-section. Also, what's the stress impact on the baby? So, was the baby dealing with major stressors during the delivery process? We already talked about how upregulated stress signaling also affects negatively neurodevelopment. And then what about foreign insults? Foreign insults. I mean, insults that were not endogenous to the body, those that are injected to the body. This is where you can set the stage, you can set the environment for coming in with injections like vaccines and actually in a susceptible individual, accelerate that already laid out pathway for pro-inflammation, accelerated delay, disruption of neurodevelopment, accelerated pro-inflammatory signaling via interleukin-6, via microglia, via nuclear factor kappa beta, via MAP kinase. All of this disrupting the immune system and actually almost creating an autoimmune activity or action against the brain, disrupting the developmental delay and causing disruption, breaking of the synaptogenesis and the communication in the brain. And so what happens here when the NIH director was talking about root causes, what you can see is how one Tylenol has multiple different proposed mechanisms, other research studies support that, but how that 1 hit of Tylenol, second, third trimester, could actually connect with other multiple hits and set the stage for the altered neurodevelopmental delay that we call autism, but also could be ADHD, cognitive slowing, behavioral issues. All of these could be a part of this process. It's not 1 hit. It's multiple hits coming together to disrupt normal development. And Tylenol, at the timing of the second and third trimester, is a critical point to contribute to this process. I hope this hot take has better explained this and really kind of removed some of the politics from it, discussing some of the proposed mechanisms and how this actually is being discussed in the literature as cause and effect. But again, it's not just looking at the impact on the developing child here, either in utero or after, but it's also what's the set stage? Because if you're reprogramming the immune system and immune signaling at that stage, if you're disrupting the gut microbiome, depleting Bifidobacterium, you're setting the stage for disease in the future, right there with that choice of Tylenol. So when you actually look at the declaration about Tylenol in pregnancy, it is proposed that you should not take it during pregnancy. So don't take Tylenol during pregnancy by all means if you can avoid it, because the concern is in this growing multiple hit society that we have because of our environment, Tylenol is just another addition just another straw on the back of that camel. And what we're seeing is we're seeing more children being diagnosed with autism and other behavioral disorders that would fall in that neurodevelopmental delay. It's because we're getting too many pieces stacked together. And we're seeing this in our children. By all means, we should protect our children because they are the canary in the coal mine for our future. I hope this hot take has helped to clear the air. And I'm Dr. Nathan Goodyear, and I'll see you on the next hot take.
Thanks for joining us on this episode of the Prescribe Podcast. All references supporting this episode can be found on the prescribe.com website. That's pre-scribe.com. To get your next dose of medical innovation, make sure you subscribe to Prescribe. We'll see you for your next refill.